So this is obviously a very difficult time in the Tibetan struggle in our history. The Chinese authorities inside Tibet have really, they're trying to control things very tightly. They're holding holding on very tightly to all movement and all sort of space in Tibet. And so for exactly this reason, a lot of people say, okay, nonviolence, great, but there's no space to do anything. There's no space to move inside Tibet. There's no space to organize these kind of campaigns that we saw in India during the movement for independence, in the U.S. for civil rights. The situation in Tibet is different.
Well, that reminds me of a particular experience I had one time. It was at a conference. It was kind of a training for nonviolent actions, actually, and there were 45 participants from different countries all over the world. And on the second day of the conference, I remember there was an Egyptian activist, who actually stood up and said, okay, so all those strategies and tactics, that we have talked about so far since yesterday, it all sounds really wonderful and nice, but it's not going to work in my country. And he went on to explain and argue why Egypt was the most oppressed place in the world, and why, things might work in Burma, it might work in China, it might work in Africa, but it's not going to work in Egypt.
And that was before
This was in 2010. Sorry, I forgot to mention the date. It was 2010, and I went over to him after that session, and I said, hey, I'm from Tibet, And the guy was like, oh, really? Okay, you know what? Tibet and Egypt are the two worst places in the world. But basically, that was 2010, and within 2 years, the way things had changed, in Egypt, like it's sky and earth, everything is different. And now this guy, he was on another interview that I saw later on, explaining how they did what they did, and like within 2 years, things can change like that. But to me, that was a lesson in how almost everyone living in under an authoritarian regime feels that they are in the worst place in the world. And I think even Tibetans are guilty of the same kind of sentiment, not to negate how much suffering people are going through, how much oppression we have to live under, but it was a reminder of no matter how bad the situation, there is no place in the earth where small acts of resistance are not possible.
Yeah, that's actually, if you think about it, it's so true when you look at the No Losar movement of 2009, because, was there any time where things were tighter inside Tibet, or the Chinese were, had completely clamped down and cracked down, and people were feeling the pain and the sting of the raids and the imprisonment and the torture and the brutal and bloody response to the uprising and the protests of 2008. And so, early 2009, February of 2009, and Tibetans inside Tibet, where there seemingly was no space, found space to organize and to engage in one of the most brilliant non-cooperation movements I think we've ever seen. Tibetans said, okay, we're not going to celebrate our own Tibetan New Year in order to, pay homage to all those Tibetans who have died or who are missing, who are suffering as a result of the crackdown. Tibetans defied Chinese direct orders to celebrate Losar. They found some way to take back control and power over their own lives in a climate where there seemingly was no space to organize or do anything.
Yeah, and during that time, the Chinese, administration in Tibet, when they didn't, find any Tibetans celebrating the New Year, they lined up a number of beggars, and they distributed butter, tea, blankets, and firecrackers, and made them burst firecrackers, and shot that, and broadcast that on what is called the Xizang TV, to show that everything is legitimate, everything is happening nicely. They had to resort to that cheap
Ludicrous.
tricks. But as you said, you know, the No Losar movement was post 2008 uh, Tibetan national uprising movement. This is a tactic that just burst out, and Tibetans inside and outside, even Tibetan officials working for Chinese government also took part in it. But interestingly, taking part in such a movement is not doing anything. That's the beauty of it. Inactivity is the most active way, and this was perhaps the only single day movement where you have largest number of Tibetans ever taking part in one day activity of resistance.
I think in one of the reasons why people say there is no space in Tibet, right, is often because people associate non-violent action or non-violent organizing immediately with images of street protests,
Right.
mass protests, big gatherings in squares, and thousands of people, you know. But if you look at the spectrum of how nonviolent resistance works and the different stages of resistance, you know, then the kinds of street protests that we saw in Prague or in
Bangladesh.
Poland, right, other countries,
the Tahrir
Serbia,
Square.
Belgrade, Cairo, those are actually kind of like in so many of the movements they come at the later stages, you know, because they are climactic, right? But before those kinds of street protests can actually be effective, or before getting to that stage, very often you go through the self-reliance phase, or the Swadeshi movement, to speak of, like what happened in India, you know. So I think for Tibetans, I think for our movement, you know, sometimes when we feel like there is no space, not much space for active political organizing, public organizing, but there is always space for building the foundations, building our own power, you know, our own networks. And to some extent, that's also beginning to happen inside Tibet, as we see, right?
And then and then continuing with that, see and analyzing how the Tibetans in Tibet, who are mostly nomads, farmers, students, and traders. These are the people who do not know and who have never heard of Martin Luther King, Professor Jin Sharp, of Gandhi. At the same time, they were the people in time came out with the most brilliant, creative methods of nonviolent resistance.
Yes.
And look at the Lhakar movement, for example. You know what is called the White Wednesday, culturally empowering movement where everybody can take part in it, and yet not costing their lives or any limbs. Here is this culturally empowering movement where everybody can take part, where it is not just symbolic, gestures of identifying themselves, but now going to a higher level where they go beyond non-cooperation, and also into self-reliance.
And it's this foundation that is absolutely key for the future of the struggle. And there is no question that we have made progress. There is, also in part because of the self-immolation movement inside Tibet, there is, Tibetans are awakened. I've heard actually a number of Tibetans from inside Tibet describe the condition of Tibetans now as awake and as ready. And I know there's been a lot of questioning about whether the self-immolations were violent, non-violent, right or wrong. I think there is no question what they have done to help awaken the people. And now that that has happened and this is done, now the key is where to move forward, how to find that space, how to claim it in ways that have sort of lower risk and higher benefit, that can continue to unify people and to strengthen our ability to carry out the very sort of acute and the campaigns that are coming, the actions that will come, where we'll have our moments, those Tahrir type, Belgrade type moments.